great. Perfect. And then for health centers that are on the line, if you could add your name and health center into the chat, that would be phenomenal. I've teed up a whole bunch of questions in preparing with Erin and Charlotte, but just to get started, Erin, if you would let us know your role, what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, what your responsibilities are, that'd be great. And then Charlotte, I'll ask you to do the same. Thanks so much for getting us started.
Sure. Thanks, Rochelle. And nice to meet all of you here on Zoom. My name is Aaron Collins. I am the Chief of Staff to State Senator Melissa Agard. She represents the 16th Senate District, and that is most of the eastern portion of Dane County. Previous to that, she was an assembly representative for about 8 years, representing the north and east sides of Madison. So as her chief of staff, I see my role a little bit as an air traffic controller, making sure that all aspects of the office are being taken care of, whether it be policy, communications, or constituent outreach. So all those things will kind of come to my desk and I'll see them. And then we have great staff members who are dealing with more of those intricate parts of the office. Previous to her being just the state senator for the 16th Senate District, she was the Senate Minority Leader last year. And so in that role, my role was slightly different in that it was more caucus management. But now she is currently running for Dane County Executive, not to get political here, but so she is back to not being the Senate leader anymore. So now we're doing more of the core functions of a state Senate office. So happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Erin, thank you so much. And I'm going to pause as we go, because sometimes when folks work in kind of political space or policymaking space, we drop words that maybe not everyone understands. The same thing of what is a caucus, Erin? You just said that casually. What is a caucus? What is that about? And then I'll go to Charlotte next.
Thank you, Rochelle. Yes, it's true. I'm sure we'll get into acronyms also that we'll have to
we've
back
got
up
plenty
for
in healthcare,
too.
so we'll
yes.
lead you astray as much as possible there.
Yep,
if we
we'll all
can.
confuse each other. So the caucus, there's 4 caucuses within the state capitol. There's the Assembly Democrats, Assembly Republicans, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans. And so within each of those caucuses, there's a leadership structure that makes the bigger decisions, kind of plays a management role within the caucus. Sometimes that looks very day to day as far as, office budgets and things like that. Or it works all the way up to caucus strategy for what amendments are we going to do? What is a floor day going to look like? But that's each of the, you've got there's a leader, assistant leader, and then typically a caucus chair that runs the internal caucus meetings.
Thank you, Erin.
Yep.
Okay. Charlotte, would love to know your background too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hi. Great to be here with everyone. Again, my name is Charlotte. I work here as part of Bryan's DC staff in his congressional office here. I've worked with Bryan since his first day in office, so about 6 years now since he's become a member of Congress. And as one of his policy advisors, I handle a portfolio for him. So I'm his national security advisor and also do his healthcare. So it's kind of a mixed bag for all of us here in Congress. That's kind of how we operate. We all have like certain legislative portfolios that we handle and advise our members of Congress on. So my days can really vary from it. This week we're in session and we're doing China week. So my week is just making sure he's up to speed on everything we're voting on and dealing with all the chaos, committee hearings, making sure he's prepped for any interviews he has. And also handling a lot of his constituent outreach, like in areas like working with Rochelle. So it can kind of be a mixed bag for a lot of us, but that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day.
Thank you, Charlotte. As we get into the conversation here today, I'll go through some questions that I've prepped, but health centers, this is really your time. We want to make sure that it's valuable for you all. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you're like, wow, I really want to learn a lot more about that thing you just said, just raise your hand and we can do a detour at any point with that. So maybe, Charlotte, I'll just start with one. Because it sounds really hard to have that breadth of topic areas in a portfolio. You're talking security and then you're hearing me bug you on 340B the
Yeah,
next minute.
it takes a lot
So,
of like brain switching to change gears all the time. Yeah.
what does that mean in terms of like subject matter expertise? How important is it in that role to hear from people who are on the ground doing work in those areas? Because it's probably impossible to know everything about national security and everything about healthcare that
Oh yeah.
Representative Steil would need to vote on. So how do
Oh,
you rely on getting the best information to inform what you do?
totally. It's critical. And before I worked for Bryan, I worked for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where my portfolio was just the Middle East. That's all I focused on. That was every day. That's all I had to look at was what's going on in the Middle East and how do I advise my boss on that. And then coming on with Bryan, it was just starting out in his office. It was just me and now our deputy chief of staff. And every portfolio was split between the two of us. So I was handling education, healthcare, veterans, social issues, you name it, things that I had never done before. So hearing from district stakeholders, I work a lot with think tanks downtown. The subject matter experts are critical for me to understand what's going on, especially Bryan from his first day in office never wanted us. We're here in a bubble in DC. I have no idea what's going on day to day in Southeast Wisconsin, let alone tracking what's going on in the state while I'm also having to advise Bryan on what's going on in China. Oh, the war in Israel, like here we go. So my days can be very scattered, which is why building relationships and hearing from really stakeholders back in the state to let me know what's important to them and what's going on and what I need to notify Bryan of is how I function. So it is absolutely critical for me.
Thanks, Charlotte. Aaron, I know the breadth of issues that a state lawmaker could take up is also really, really wide and perhaps, different than federal issues, but, everything from health to, again, education, as Charlotte mentioned, has state level work there too. The office that you work in is a little bit unique because it's got multiple staff, but, how many people are typically in a legislative office? Again, I'm thinking of just how much the breadth of work is that can come to that office. And again, how important it is to know who to go to ask questions of particular issues.
Yeah, so I'll work up. So starting in the assembly, when I worked for Melissa in the assembly, when a legislator is first elected to the assembly, you get one staffer. And we would also have interns that would help with our day-to-day operations, but I was her only staffer coming in. And so when people would say, oh, are you her chief of staff? I'd say, well, I'm the chief of me, and I am the person that you will come to for any and all things related to her, whether it's her committee assignments, bills she's working on. As you move up through your career, after you are not a freshman legislator anymore in the assembly, you get either two staffers, or if you're in the majority party, we have an odd system here where you get 1.5 staffer. If you are in the minority party, it is not a half a person, it is split between two offices. And then as you go, if you do decide to run for the Senate eventually, like Melissa did, in the minority party, you get 3. And in the majority party, you get 4. And then if you are in a leadership office, it goes up. I think when we were in the leadership office, we had 10 total staffers. So knowing that's a lot of numbers being thrown around, but it is important to kind of understand how big of a staff you're dealing with and who the person that you need to talk to. Like I said, if you're in the assembly in a freshman staff or a freshman office, it's just the one staff person that you need to keep contact with. And as you move up into a leadership office, you probably need to speak to somebody here at the state level, the equivalent of Charlotte, who is a policy director or a policy advisor. And really, it's not more complicated than just when you call the office or email the office, asking who you should be speaking to about any individual issue. And so if you say, I want to talk about this bill, who would I talk to on that? Every office will be able to direct you to the right person.
And some of those offices, Aaron, that just have one staff person in them, is it necessarily a subject matter expert in something or not usually?
It would, I would say more likely you're going to be speaking to somebody who's a little bit more of a generalist because they have to deal with all of the committees, they have to deal with all of the constituent issues that are coming forward. And so they're going to have their hands in a lot of different pots. And even though it is just that one staffer, don't be shy about talking to them about the issue because they're going to, specifically if it's district related, that legislator is going to want to know. In Wisconsin, we're actually lucky that we do have such strong staff support, which allows us to serve the district better and serve the legislator in a good way. There's other states. I know, for example, in Minnesota, I was taken aback one time. I called what I thought was the office number for a bill that we wanted to seek some guidance on from a legislator in Minnesota, and the legislator actually answers. It goes to their cell phone. So it's a little bit of a different system there. I'm biased as a staffer, but I do think it allows us to have a little bit more reach and keeps our office operations going smoothly.
So often when I'm talking with folks from community health centers, maybe they're new to their role or maybe there's a new lawmaker. What do you both recommend for starting a relationship with a policymaker or with their staff? And when should they lean on, DC staff? Charlotte, obviously I work with you pretty closely, but when is it better to go to district staff where the health center is located to begin that work? Charlotte, maybe I'll have you start with that one.
I think just starting off is introducing yourself, giving us a little context about your group or what you're affiliated with, and some background. As I said before, I mean, a lot of the congressional staff here, we handle anywhere from like 8 to 12 portfolios at once. So saying, here are the basics of what we do, and this is why we're important in our impact in your district. So a lot of the times, if you start out the gates, letting me know why you're important to the state and why my boss, Bryan, should not pay attention, but what are the actual district impacts? Like we have a facility in Racine, Kenosha, Beloit, and this is how many people we employ. And these are our main issues that you can help us with federally. That's a great way to start out with me, to be like, okay, I've got some general background. This is how we can maybe be helpful. That's a great starting point, at least for me. The difference between the DC staff, a lot of it, we are the funders here. So a lot of outreach we get is, hey, we need money. Especially as we're going through the FY24, FY25, you name it, cycles. That's where I receive a lot of outreach. Or, if there's some regulatory issues you guys are dealing with from HHS or whomever it may be, that's somewhere where I can help intervene. If, say, the district staff, one thing we help a lot with, and this may not be directly tied to you, but we do a lot of casework. So say you're having an issue with your community health center bringing someone in who needs a visa. That's a great way for you to reach out to our office and be like, hey, is there anything you guys can do? Because that's something our office can help with, and expediting certain we've done that for many different companies, for example. But that's a good differentiation between the DC office, which is mostly policy focused, and our district offices, which do a lot of casework specifically.
Thanks, Charlotte. Aaron, anything to add there on getting a relationship started? Should that be, coming into an office, picking up the phone, inviting someone for coffee? How do you just set the baseline?
I think that beginning it like any other, professional relationship with some outreach, either via email or a phone call, and saying, I'd like to speak to somebody, about community health centers first and foremost. I think that building those foundational pieces are important to kind of give definitions, and what actually you all do out in the field is really important. That could look like a one-pager on what community health centers are. That could look like inviting the legislator out to your health center to say, do you want to come tour one of these? That would be really helpful. I think almost all legislators universally like little field trips like that to get out to their district to see what's going on. And I also think there is real value in seeing what it is that you're talking about. So that way, when there is a piece of legislation coming forward that is going to impact your group, you're not for the first time knocking at the door and saying, hey, you need to vote for this bill, because that's not, you don't want to be the friend you haven't seen in 5 years asking you for a ride to the airport. You want to be the one who's been there, texting them, calling them. It's no different than any other relationship. And from Rochelle's advocacy piece, she comes into the Capitol quite a bit just to drop off one-pagers, to drop off information about what's going on. And that consistent communication is really the most important thing, because you don't want to have contact every year or two, and then you say, oh, remind me what this is about again, because then you have to kind of start from square one. So I would just say as much consistent communication as possible.
Yeah, Aaron noted that, sometimes I go by the Capitol just to keep us on the radar, not when I have an ask. I just kind of want to make sure that health centers are in the mix. So I also send things to media, like an article, here's a news story, here's something we want to celebrate. And then hopefully, even if something isn't relevant the first time, maybe it is the third, the fourth, the fifth time. And maybe it was just, maybe the first day that we talked, there was a lot going on. So I like to find different avenues and ways to engage, even if there isn't like a direct ask. But often you go into an office and they want to know, what can I do about this for you? Or what do you need from me today? And it's good to have an answer to that question, or know if it's just, we want you to learn about XYZ, or we want you to come and follow up to see us in person. Those would still be good asks.
Yeah. Also, just to build upon
please.
that, I think one thing that we've done well together is you kind of keep me apprised of bills that are coming to the floor or what committee is marking up. And a lot of the time, because I'm tracking many different things, you're like, hey, by the way, this is going through Energy and Commerce, and we have concerns with these three items. Is a great way for me to trigger it in my head, being like, okay, great, this actually has a state impact, a district impact. And this is like, that would be something I'd flag for Bryan, being like, hey, this might be moving out of committee. There are some concerns that could impact the district specifically and our community health centers there. So you always keep me up to date on what those priorities are for you and potential concerns. And that's so helpful for me in just keeping the line of communication open.
Well, I appreciate that, Charlotte. For me, I'm very fortunate because that's my job. So, that's what I love to do. And at the same time, I think a lot of health centers, like, when you're doing a million other things, they can't be tracking every federal bill. I've got to keep my eyes on that. But I think the relationship there is about having that trust with the health center, so that, that they're doing good work, so that when there is a thing, you can rely on that perspective to inform how you and your Representative Steil are making decisions about stuff that's coming up, so that we're reliable, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So, we've talked a little bit about action on legislation. What factors influence how Melissa and Bryan engage on an issue? Let's say, I'll give you an example. So next year, we're going to have an ask that's going to be a budget thing for the state government. And that's going to be a policy issue in state government. It's making a little change to a statute to provide some funding for lookalikes in some state dollars that we currently receive. And I'll just tee it up as this is, not a partisan issue. So it's not something that is really strictly, the Dems are going to love it or the Republicans are going to love it. So take that as, granted in my case here, but what's gonna influence whether the lawmaker co-sponsors the bill, whether they prioritize working on the bill, and how they vote on the bill? What are the factors influencing that decision? Maybe Aaron, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would highlight a few. First, sometimes whether or not a legislator is on a particular committee might influence them. So if by chance Melissa was on the health committee and it was going to go to that committee, that could actually influence her either way. In one scenario, she might say, oh, I want to help get this through committee, so I'm going to sign on to this bill. And then when the committee sees my name on there, sees it's bipartisan, that will be helpful. Or she might say, well, I'm on the committee, I'm going to wait and see because I want to see the public hearing and I want to see what's going on. Secondly, there's a system here in Wisconsin called Eye on Lobbying that's run by the Ethics Commission. And so when any group that is registered as a lobbying group wants to lobby on a bill, and they can give it a that they support the bill, that they oppose the bill, or they can be neutral, but they can register some comments on it. When Melissa is going to committee, I will print off the bill information, any amendments, and I will also print off that that ethics report, because it will show her, oh, community health centers, Rochelle, they're registered in support of this. I remember she came and talked to me on that. And so getting back to the point that Charlotte was making, it's that trust with somebody that you're working with that gives the legislator the background to say, yep, that is a good thing. I remember that Rochelle came in and talked to me. Or I remember I went out and visited a health center and that made sense to me when we talked about it. So I think those are the primary factors that she would look at. And then finally, if there are constituents that are concerned about a bill, that I would pull any constituent contacts that we had, either for or against, and say, hey, we heard from 3 people who said that this is good, that this is, people are supportive of this bill.
And Aaron, at the same time, depending on the registrants, maybe it would also share the opposite. If there's a group where you're like, oh, we tend to disagree with those folks on policy matters, it might have the other influencing factor, right?
Exactly. And I think that Melissa tries to approach most issues with an open mind of, oh, let's take a look at this. But I will say it is a signal if there's groups that maybe she has historically disagreed with, that it would be a signal that, okay, that might not be something I support. And in fact, I've heard her ask people in meetings before, say Rochelle comes into the office, gives a great explanation of the bill, but Melissa might ask, what would opponents of this bill say? And why would somebody be opposed to this? Because of course, if you're supporting something, you're going to be able to give it a glowing review, but what would the other side say on that, just so they can weigh the options and see what the other side of that coin may be.
That's such a good point, Aaron. And I think that speaks to our need to always know all of the perspectives on an issue. I mean, you can't know everything always, but to at least have a sense of what is the opposition so that you can speak to that. Because the one thing policymakers really don't like is to be surprised, to think there aren't objections, or to think it's something simple that you've presented as really clear cut. And it turns out there's a whole lot more to uncover once you have a conversation. People really don't like that. And, we don't work on a lot of really controversial issues, but even on a state level issue like Medicaid expansion, if we can't really talk to what the trade-offs are, we're not providing the full picture, and we're probably doing a disservice to that policymaker too. Okay, Charlotte, what else? What are those factors that you all are looking at? And especially talk with us a little bit about like prioritization, because you can't do everything. So how do you figure out where to really like champion things, put your efforts in, aside from just like, yeah, we support that. Good.
Yeah.
Carry on.
I think Aaron, also, you hit a ton of points that are probably the same for us, but for prioritization, I will say it definitely varies depending on your member of Congress. You have members who want to do anything and everything and will co-sponsor literally any bill that comes across their desk. They don't care. I can speak to Bryan and how we operate. is there are definitely portfolios and issue areas that he's very comfortable with. Oops, sorry. Of course, I've been in here too long, the light turns out. Sorry about that, everyone. So we kind of stick to areas he's more comfortable with. Like, he serves on the Financial Services Committee, and he's also chair of House Administration here. So anything that touches or goes through his committees are areas he's really willing and more engaged upon, especially if it's more of a contentious issue. If it's, say, for community health centers, it's easy. Like, normally I can bring it to Bryan. He's like, okay, there's no issue. Here we go. You can sign my name on. But if we're talking about Social Security reform, he's going to be like, this is sort of out of my wheelhouse. I'm not on the health committee, kind of what Aaron said before. That might be a space he's like, keep me updated. Let me know what bills are out there. Let me know what the Senate is doing versus the House, and where all the players land, because that's very helpful information for him to know. But for him to actually be an outlier and engage on it is probably not something he's going to do, since it's sort of out of his wheelhouse.
Sure.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm just going to put a quick reminder, and I do hear some background noise. If folks can go ahead and mute themselves, or Carly, if you can help people with some muting, that would be great. Aaron and Charlotte, you both mentioned committees. How do committee selections occur? And is it based on interest, other factors? How does that work? Aaron, maybe I'll have you start.
Here in the Capitol, in Wisconsin at the state level, the committee assignments are given by your specific caucus leadership. And so typically, in my experience, it has been the leader will send out a request for committee assignment requests. The member will say, here's my top 5 committees that I'd like to be on. And then the leader will look at those requests, balance who needs to be on what committees, and who has subject area expertise on particular issues. Sometimes that is dependent on what the actual, both the committees are and what the committee makeup is. It does change occasionally here, where depending on who's in the majority, they might switch committees around, add a committee, depending on who the leader is, the majority leader, they might add a committee that is more to their liking, their subject area expertise. And then you need to look at what the partisan breakdown is, whether the committee is, say 3-2 to the majority, or some different ratio. So when Melissa was the leader, we went through that process, and it's always the hope that everybody's happy. That never tends to happen, that everyone's 100% happy, but you do hope that you get the people who are best suited to each committee on there. But ultimately, every legislator ends up with some committees that they're going to really know a lot about, and some that you may say, oh, I don't know too much about that, but yeah, I'm happy to serve. And I've heard one legislator say one time that a lot of times, you run for office and you think that you're going to be focused on one thing because you've done it at the local level, or you had a business that did a certain thing, but really at the end of the day, the issues that you work on, kind of, they choose you in a way. Not to go Harry Potter in the sorting hat here, but you might have a constituent come and say, I have this issue and I need you to work on it. And then you work on legislation, and then you find that, oh, that's actually an issue that I really care about. Like Melissa had no background in digital privacy, but had some constituents come to her first session, and she ended up authoring and passing through some bipartisan pieces of legislation on digital privacy. So a lot of there's so many different ways that it can happen, but committees do play a role in that.
Charlotte, anything else about committee processes, appointments?
Yeah, it can be pretty
complicated
here. So at least for Bryan, when he was first elected, we kind of thought we had some committees we thought he would be on, and committees that he wanted to go for. So we kind of thought he would be on financial services and foreign affairs. And here there are A committees, there's B committees, and there's C committees. A committees being like the ones that are most sought after, B committees are very good, and C committees are more things people probably don't love. So we were shooting for 1 and 2 for financial services and foreign affairs. And a lot of it is really up to, your member's background. So say Mike Gallagher, former member, obviously a service member, he was being placed on armed services made a lot of sense. For Bryan, who's not a veteran, not a former service member, he probably wouldn't be placed on Veterans Affairs or Armed Services. And given his background, financial services made a lot of sense for him. But for us, it really does come down to leadership and where they want to place you, your background, your resume. If you're a member who isn't very much a team player and very vocal and not supportive of your delegation or your team, you're probably not going to get the best committee assignment. So a lot of those personnel things also play into it. We also have things called whips. So Bryan is a part of his regional whip team. So he sits kind of a group of members that handles Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so when members want to switch committees, or they're like, hey, I want to jump from foreign affairs to be on Ways and Means, they'll come to Bryan, give their pitch. This is why I want to be on Ways and Means. This is why I think I would be the best member for this. And then he goes to vote for if he thinks that person should be a part of Ways and Means, if they should not. So there's so many different little games. And in the end, leadership could just say, nope, we're not going to do it. That goes for both parties. So it can really be a kind of convoluted process. But for us, for short example, Bryan is the chairman of House Administration. And the only reason he got on that committee really was he had an interaction with the former chairman in an elevator who was like, oh, Bryan's a great guy. That's a funny guy. I really like him. You should be on our committee. I had no idea what House Admin even did or obviously Bryan's the chairman now, so we work very heavily, but at first we're like, what are you talking about? Like House Admin, what's even that portfolio? What do they do? And it was purely because Rodney Davis was just like, Bryan's a cool guy. Like, I want him on my committee. And now he's chairman. Like, it can be as easy as that.
I bet there are more decisions that happen like that than we would ever know of.
Oh yeah, one thing I will say is working here for almost 9 years now, a lot of this institution really reflects Veep. I don't know if people have seen that show. People think it's like crazy stuff that happens here. A lot of it is just really like that show. I think that's a great representation of what goes on in Congress. But you didn't hear that from me.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Charlotte, I'm dying to know what's an example of a C committee. Do you have one off the top of your head?
Oversight and ethics are probably not like the most sought after, I would say.
Well, and I think for a reference point, in the state legislature, the health committees are like super sought after because all constituents care about health. Everyone, interacts with health in their daily lives. And so, the people who do get selected for health committees, tend to be people who, if you have a health background, that
right.
helps.
Like if you're a doctor, you have a health background for sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Rochelle, just to add to that really quickly, that I think Charlotte and I both had kind of long-winded, very insider baseball answers because these committee processes and how things work within each caucus or conference in Congress are really complex, and they are based on relationships a lot of times. So I would advise still starting with your local legislator, whether it's state rep, state senator, member of Congress, and then they may say, oh, talk to the chairperson of the health committee who I know and I can introduce you to. But creating that good foundational relationship with your legislator is a good place to start, because it does get very complicated very fast. And these internal things that Charlotte and I deal with, but most of the public is just not not privy to, because it is sort of just based on conversations and things like that. And I would just add that Melissa is scared to watch Veep because she thinks it's going to be too real to her, and
It's real.
it's real, and she doesn't want to do it. So I keep trying to get her to watch it.
Okay, so that was a good reminder for me, Aaron, to get out of the weeds a little bit. Tactically, so often, there will be a bill up for a vote, and maybe, or something that we're asking for lawmakers to co-sponsor would be another example. That's a way for them to show their support on something. So I'll often encourage health centers to call in to their lawmakers, their constituent representatives, and say, vote for this bill or co-sponsor this thing or vote no, whatever our perspective is. And we hope that that influences the process. Charlotte, can you talk about what's happening on your end of the phone? What is happening relative to tracking that input that you all are receiving? What are you taking note of with calls or emails, and what does that kind of system look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's many different ways that co-sponsorships and things will come to my desk. Generally, I like to take an approach with my portfolio of kind of like filling all of our buckets, so Bryan always has something to talk about. But in terms of bills, obviously, if it's you bring me a co-sponsorship that has 100 Democrats and 1 Republican, that's probably not something I'm going to talk to Bryan about, just because we like to keep things pretty even and don't like him to be an outlier on things. But I am constantly people do it different ways. For me, I have my Excel sheet of my different portfolios. And if more than one group is reaching out to me about a bill that they're endorsing, that's something I'm tracking. And say like 5 different groups are supporting HR 123. And I think it's a good opportunity for Bryan. That's something I would go talk to him about and be like, hey, this is what it does. Here are the co-sponsors. I talk to committee and they say this is something that's going to move, or, this is something good for you to talk about. And here is the district impact, the national impact, Wisconsin impact. And here are all the groups that have been endorsing it, opposing it. So we kind of give him the menu of all of that. And then he kind of makes the decision as to whether that's something he wants to attach his name to or not.
And Charlotte, if we have folks who are just placing a call into the general call line in DC, maybe they're reaching someone who they might hypothesize as an intern based on the conversation.
It usually is, but we have like a computer tracking system.
Yeah, so talk with us a little bit about that. Are you like totaling the pros, the yays and the nays that you get? What do you do?
We are. Again, very much depending on the congressional office. Some people don't respond at all. Bryan's made it a priority from the first day. We responded to everyone. And that's something I, in my job, am constantly looking at. So we have a legislative correspondent whose job is looking at every single call we get, every single email we get, and we put them into different buckets depending on the area. So we know every single week what someone's contacting us about. So say 10 people wrote in this week saying, I support puppies, whatever it may be. And it's like, hey, Charlotte, like, you handle animal welfare. We had 10 people reach out to us about this bill supporting it. I'm like, oh, okay, let me take a look at the bill. I pull it up and it's like, oh, this has 150 co-sponsors. Like, this is an easy messaging bill that I can talk to Bryan about, and then we can email this group of 10 people back saying, oh, Bryan co-sponsored the bill. Thank you so much for flagging it for us. So for us, our mails and the phone calls we get from our constituents do come to the policy advisors, absolutely, and to his attention. So we are constantly looking on that and ways we can message back and what's important back home. And it's great for my job here. I'm in DC. I don't know necessarily what's going back at home all the time. And we're very close with our district staff as well. But reaching out to your member of Congress is a great way for me to know, or as the staffer on the other side of it, being like, hey, we've had like 100 people reach out to us this week. This is something we can actually engage on. And also, total side note, we've also written bills that way. So we actually had a woman reach out to us because she was having to pay her mom's death benefits back to the VA. And we were like, that seems weird. Like, she already got the check and probably used it. Why is she having to pay this back? And actually, me looking at the statute, it was because one date in US code said by the end of the month. And we just wrote a bill to move it to the beginning so that the VA couldn't do this. And it can be ideas like that. And I think, Aaron, you touched on this before, how that kind of stuff issues can find you. So this has really become a big issue for Bryan, just because that one woman was like, this is weird. Why am I having to do this? And it just took me digging into the US code to being like, oh, this is why, because the data is weird. And we tried to fix it. So issues do find you.
And Charlotte, there's a great question in the chat here, but I'm going to ask you to define first, what is a messaging bill? What does that mean?
Okay, a messaging bill. So messaging bills can mostly like resolutions, being like suicide prevention month. Like, we're going to designate, I think this month, September, is suicide prevention month. For us, I would kind of put that in the bucket of a messaging bill, where we can go saying, I signed a resolution designating the month of September as suicide prevention month. Then you have really substantive bills that I would say, so our veterans bill that we've worked on, which is actually making technical changes to the US code, I would not categorize that as something that's purely messaging. Or you have people who introduce bills just anywhere saying like, oh, support Veterans Week. To me, that's just messaging in a way for a member to be like, I support veterans. I introduce a bill that says I support veterans, is how I'd categorize a messaging bill.
Aaron, anything you'd like to add there about how you think about messaging bills, or kind of what role they have in the process?
Yeah, I think I would just add one more category is a bill that, in the case in Wisconsin, with Melissa being in the minority party, she might put out a bill to bring an issue to the forefront, even though she knows it may not pass. A good example is, we've been dealing with a lot of housing issues in the district with housing affordability. And so she wanted to do something on down payment assistance, which is often a barrier to home ownership. And so we put out a bill that we knew was unlikely to pass, but that brought the issue forward. And so people were speaking about it. And I would say that's just another variation on what Charlotte was talking about, where
that's a great point.
Bring an issue to the forefront that you might not cross the finish line that session.
It's also a good demonstration as an alternative. Like, we like to set markers of, hey, Bryan doesn't support this, but here's the alternative that he would support. And we do a bill on that to show kind of his marker and how he would approach an issue. So that's a great point, Aaron.
So if someone's calling either of your offices, should they be referencing a specific bill? If this is something that's like a real clear action, like we want you to do X. If they don't know the bill number, or if they don't have the details about it, how much information do they need to have? Should they be prepared to answer a whole bunch of questions? How much do they need to know, and how do they figure out all that information if they're just kind of a lay person going about their lives? Aaron, I'll have you start with that one.
I think the biggest change that I've seen during my time working in the legislature is that the constituent outreach has become much less personal. And this is partially because of, we can get into a lot of factors. Partially, there's some lack of local news at the state level, but also just because people are busy and they want to be able to interact with the political system, but don't necessarily have time. So some organizations, and it is a benefit to get a huge number of emails coming in, but we will get form letters that come in by the dozens. And even though the number is good for me to bring to Melissa and say, we've received, 30 emails about this, if they are all the exact same email, and to the point where somebody might say, you know, dear Senator Agard, my name is, and it will say like fill name in here because they didn't see that they needed to fill their name in here. That will not have the same impact as if you write a 3-sentence email saying, this is who I am, I live in your district, and I would like you to co-sponsor Senate Bill 621, because it's personal, it's concise, and it has a clear ask. So those would be the 3 things that I would highlight, whether you're making a phone call or an email. Some semblance that you are, a person from the district who wants the elected official to do whatever the item is, whether co-sponsor it or please don't co-sponsor this bill, but just make sure that the action item is clear in the email.
Charlotte, you guys get a lot of form letters?
Oh my gosh, yes. I feel
How
so
many
deeply
do
what
you
you just said, Erin. So
estimate?
deeply.
Yeah, so I mean, WIPCA does use a system, and we have this tool, but we try to use it really sparingly for exactly what Erin just noted, is that unless there's some personal component to it, we kind of recognize that the impact is limited unless we're really going for like huge volume or something where we really want to show that like this is impacting hundreds of people and we really need your attention on it. But how do you receive those communications? Are they meaningful?
It is we do take into account, like this week we got a batch of like 350 messages on a certain topic. So that's something we discuss, like, hey, they're all form letters of the type in your name here, same thing. But I will differentiate the email that I get that says, or, hey, Bryan, I'm tracking this bill, would love for you to co-sponsor. This would really help X, Y, and Z. That's personal to me. That's going to get you a call back directly from me if you send that through our website versus signing whatever form letter. So it doesn't mean we're not going to pay attention to form letters. We still respond to them. But if you take the 1 minute to send a personal message on whatever issue is important to you through our website, you're going to get a direct call from the staffer who handles the issue area in our office and get a lot more attention to the issue you're looking for.
Thanks for that hot tip. I have never directed people to the website, so that is an adjustment that I will make in our process. Thanks for teaching us something new. Kelly's asking, so I'll send specific bills that like we care about on behalf of health centers, whether it's, like there's a workforce bill that, I want to put on some folks' radar, and I was trying to figure out if it's a really serious bill or if it's not. How does a regular person learn about what legislation is on the table, in the works, moving through the process at the federal level or at the state level? So what can someone do to get started in understanding that, Charlotte?
I think one would just be reaching out to the office. I think, Erin, you mentioned this before, but calling up and being like, hey, who handles healthcare in your office and can I get their email? That's a great way to start. So reaching out, obviously here in Bryan's office, I handle healthcare. Reaching out to me being like, hey, like this workforce bill is really important to us. Do you mind checking in with committee to see if this is something they're considering? That's a great, as Bryan's not on the health committee, that's something an easy action item I can take to get information to you, to reach out to them being like, hey, are there any issues with this? Is this something that's on the committee agenda for the year? And that's direct feedback I can get to you. That committee will tell me being like, no, this is a dumpster fire of an issue. We're actually looking at this alternative. Or they can be like, actually, we're doing a workforce hearing week in October, and we're planning on marking this up. And when you receive that information, you can be like, oh, great. Like this bill is moving. It's going to move through committee. That's helpful knowledge in reaching out to, say, the rest of the Wisconsin delegation, being like, hey, we heard from Energy and Commerce, this bill is moving. Would you consider co-sponsoring it? So it may not be like a co-sponsorship ask, but you can definitely engage with your federal legislators to be like, hey, I'm just wondering if this bill has any legs. And that's something I can easily check in with committee and see if it's a go or a no-go and why.
And Charlotte, if that's relative to a specific bill, that sounds really helpful. If someone's just trying to understand kind of more broadly, what legislation is going on related to, let's say, health issues or education. I mean, there's literally thousands of bills that are introduced. So it's kind of hard unless you're a little bit honed in on a topic area, perhaps. And then there's ways to learn about what's going on in that topic area, right?
I think one way is to look at the committees of jurisdiction. So see what themes they're having for each week for hearings. Look at the subcommittees. So looking at our health subcommittee and seeing what bills they're marking up, what they're moving, you'll get a really good flavor about what the subcommittee chairman or the chairman of the whole committee is looking to do. A lot of the times it can be very unclear. Like we had our leadership meeting yesterday trying to figure out what we're doing the last week of session in September, and they're like, we don't know. So a lot of time, like, I have no idea what we're doing the last week of September. They basically just told us, like, depends on the news cycle. No idea what that means. So it really is, for us, sometimes we truly have no idea. But you can get a good flavor from looking at the committee websites and just reaching out to the staffer to be like, hey, this is kind of what we feel as the menu of what's going to be the priority in this space. But especially this Congress more than others, I will say I have gone into weeks or lots of months where we had no idea what's happening.
And Charlotte, you just used a term I also want you to define. What is a markup?
Oh, it's when a committee will basically take a look at a piece of legislation and members can offer amendments of their own on how to change it. So a lot we'll have, like, say in financial services, we'll have themes, or we're going to mark up like a bunch of proxy advisor bills, or we're doing energy week and energy and commerce, and they'll take like 10 bills and take a look at them, and where members can offer their changes and they can debate the issues, pros and cons on both sides. And then all the members on that committee will either vote it out or it'll be shut down. And if it's voted out of committee, then it's up for floor consideration and could move to the floor for a vote.
And I see a question from Karen. Where specifically do we find that information? Karen, are you referencing what the bills are that are basically before committees? Is that what you're asking?
Correct. Like, where specifically would you go? You mentioned the committee websites. So
yeah, if you go to housenet.gov, you can find a list of all congressional committees. So we have, like I mentioned, Ways and Means, Financial Services, the Agriculture Committee, Energy and Commerce. So all issue areas will be kind of broken up between these larger committees. And so say you go to the Foreign Affairs Committee website, they have a subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. And you can click that and be like, okay, this is everything that they're doing in regards to Western Hemisphere. You can go to Energy and Commerce and click their healthcare subcommittee website. And it should pop up and you can see they have a majority and minority page, which is also a good distinction. So you can look at the chairman of the committee and read their one paragraph they put together and get a good flavor about their priority versus majority and minority. So that's a great place to start, just to get a flavor of what a committee chairman and ranking member are planning to do with their chairmanship and what their priorities are. And then you can go and click tabs as to what hearings they're holding and learning about who they're bringing in to testify, what bills they're marking up. And a lot of them, committees try and do themes to try and keep things organized. Like the health committee will do like a mental health week where they'll host a hearing with the director of SAMHSA over at Health and Human Services. And then they'll also mark up like 10 mental health bills from an array of members. So people try and keep certain themes, so it's not super confusing. Hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Thank you, Charlotte. And Aaron dropped in the state legislative website. We have a phenomenal state legislative website. Like, you can find all the committees, the pending bills, the members, and it's really easy to navigate. Once you know the bill number, like in the state, it would be like SB 12. Once you know that, it's relatively straightforward to look through the pages and kind of figure out what's going on once you kind of know how to navigate it. We just have a minute or two left here. So Aaron and Charlotte, I'm wondering if you can leave our advocates with a tip or trick on effective engagement, maybe an example that you've seen go really well or something to avoid. Just any last thoughts are more than welcome. Aaron, I'll start with you.
I'll just give a quick suggestion to you all. Go to that website that's in the chat, find out who your state representative and state senator are. Go follow them on social media, sign up for their e-update. This is, Charlotte was explaining the very complex bill process. That is all on the legislative website, but I think just having the information come to you, whether it's in your social media feed or getting those emails. Melissa sends a bi-weekly email. Unfortunately, when it's campaign season in the state legislature, we are prohibited from sending anything more than 49 pieces of something that is identical, basically to prohibit, you can't send a legislative e-update during campaign time because it allows you to kind of use the power of incumbency to campaign. But a lot of legislators are moving towards a really nice informational e-update that comes every so often. So I would just absolutely recommend to all of you to follow along with your legislators. You'll get a good idea of what's happening in the Capitol.
Definitely.
Thank you, Aaron. And again, that was basically like it's an e-update and everyone does it at different cadences, but it really can help you understand what are the types of issues and how do they frame things so that you can get a sense of maybe how do you connect your issue area with the type of messaging that lawmaker may be more open to receiving. Charlotte, any last thoughts?
I think one thing I will say, and I do get it a lot, is kind of picking your priorities, especially when reaching out to your advisors in different offices. I do have people approach me with 17 different bills they want Bryan to co-sponsor. And I promise you, I've lost you after number 5. Just being very, very honest. So reaching out to me being like, hey, I have these 2 action items that I really think Bryan could engage on. I'm more likely to really focus on 1 and 2 than if you send me 15. That happens way more often than I would like to admit. But if you have one thing that you are really focused on, start with that, especially with federal legislator staff. And I promise you'll get more direct attention on that 1 and 2 item than if you send us 15.
Excellent tip. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Aaron. We could have this conversation all day, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. For our health center folks, if this stimulated any additional questions or follow-ups, or if you really want to know where a resource is that was referenced and don't know where to get started, please let me know. I'm happy to help you navigate. And Aaron and Charlotte, again, thank you both, not only for today, but just for being really reliable sources of truth and responsive to the work that community health centers are doing. Like I said, not all staff are as engaged or, committed to serving, constituents in the district and the needs of the state. And I've just found you both to be really wonderful to work with and intentional. So appreciate you both. And thank you everyone for joining. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.